My name is Eitan Chatayat, and welcome to I'm That podcast, where I get to talk to some pretty incredible people. Some are friends and colleagues, some are clients, and some are people I haven't even met yet. On I'm That, we'll hear from them about who they are, what they do and why, stuff they love or hate, mistakes they've made, victories they've had. They're all known for something, but by the time we're through, the hope is they'll have revealed some things we didn't know about them. Our talk may be deep, profound, funny, who knows really. One thing for sure, it'll be interesting and honest. So if you're up for that, thank you for joining me on I'm That, and here we go. Aviva Klompas is the co-founder and CEO of Boundless. She has made a name for herself as an outspoken advocate for the Jewish people and as a leading Israel educator. Before launching Boundless, she served as the director of speechwriting for Israel's permanent mission to the United Nations in New York City and as a senior policy advisor in the Ontario government, supporting efforts to resettle Syrian refugees in Canada. A prolific writer, Aviva has written articles that have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, Foreign Policy, the Jerusalem Post, and other well-known international publications. She's also the author of 2 books. Her first, Speaking for Israel, reflects on her time as a speechwriter for Israel and offers an honest and entertaining insight into Israeli diplomacy. Highly recommend that you read it. Her second book, Stand Up Nation, Israeli Resilience in the Wake of Disaster, released in 2024, details Israel's remarkable and long-standing work in international development. The book builds on Israel's rich history of international development and profiles 18 extraordinary Israelis involved in international development work today. Aviva submitted the book's manuscript before October 7th, and since the 7th, she's devoted herself to the narrative war on social media and improving Israeli hasbara. Like many of us, she's focused on getting the truth out there and literally telling Israel's story to the world. I am so honored to have her on I'm That. So I'm, first of all, just so happy that you're on the podcast with me.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, you're amazing, and everyone will find out why, those who don't know you. But let's start off with the question that I usually ask, which is for you to just complete this sentence. So if you can, Aviva Klompas, I'm that
Zionist Jew that you keep seeing on social media that just won't quit.
Wow. Okay, that is pretty damn accurate. So this thing that you're doing is unbelievable, especially, I mean, X is your Twitter, X is your platform, right?
I've been on X for 10 years, yeah. Back when it was Twitter, exactly.
What do you do? I mean, for people who don't know, what are you doing?
Well, X or Twitter isn't my real life. I used to be the speechwriter for Israel's delegation to the United Nations. And that was about 10 years ago. And it was actually one of the Israeli diplomats who said to me, you need to get onto X. And I said, I don't think anybody needs to hear from me on social media. That's just fine. My opinions can be kept right with me. And he said, no, you don't understand. It's really important. This is where diplomats and politicians and journalists are having conversations, and you want to be a part of the conversation. So quite reluctantly, I joined. I think it was 20. I don't even know when it was. We'd have to go look. It's posted on X. And it was.
Was that Ron Prosor?
Ambassador Ron Prosor was the ambassador that I wrote for, but it was actually Yisrael Nitzan, who was one of the diplomats at the time, and he later went on to be the acting consul general for Israel in New York. He was the one that convinced me. And actually, not that long ago, I was talking to him, and we were reflecting on the fact that he got me started on X, and he said to me, "We created a monster, but at least you're our monster."
You are definitely our monster. I don't know. I mean, you're just like relentless. You're just like a powerhouse of information. And you're doing such an amazing job advocating for the Jewish people and for Israel. And we'll get into all of that. But actually, the first thing that I wanted to ask you is just like your time as a speechwriter at the UN. Like, what did you learn about, I don't know, narratives and messaging and storytelling in your role there? Because that's ultimately what you're doing with a lot of facts. But how did that kind of influence you?
Yeah, there's no question that my time as the speechwriter has influenced the way that I'm communicating with the world right now. The first way, which is actually not about storytelling, it's simply the quantity of information that I had to be able to take in, process, and then churn out something that was coherent and persuasive. And the speechwriter for Israel at the United Nations, when I was there anyways, it's basically one person, and if you're lucky, an intern. And you're responsible for all the English language communications. There is an inordinate number of speeches at the United Nations. Sometimes it's an emergency session, especially in a high conflict period like we see right now. But in addition to speeches, you're responsible for op-eds, letters to the editor, letters to the General Assembly, letters to the President of the Security Council, social media, and on and on and on. And it's just an enormous around-the-clock responsibility. And so I got very, very quick at absorbing a lot of information, processing it, and churning it out. It's, for 10 years, been my approach to news. So first of all, I'm a big consumer of news and information. And then at the UN, especially under Ambassador Ron Persor, it was about being sharp and precise. There's actually something at the United Nations called a right of reply, which is the opportunity when one country speaks against another community to give a retort. And Ambassador Persor always wanted those to be retorts that could actually make headlines for how pithy and punchy they were. And that is actually a skill that comes in quite useful on Twitter or on X. The algorithm has changed over the years and continues to change. But in general, that ability to make an argument tight and precise is what I really learned to do 10 years ago and very much what I do now. The other thing about the United Nations is that it's a lot of theater. There's no question about that. There's what you see at the surface in public, and then there's what happens behind the scenes. And especially in the Middle East, we know that long before the Abraham Accords, there were these quiet relations between Israel and some of the more moderate countries in the Middle East. And there's also the expectation that this country is going to go after that country and this country is going to walk out on that country. It's a little bit like high school theater in all seriousness in the way that these things play out. And this is more to Ambassador Persor's credit than anything else, which he was very adamant that even though the UN is the same old, it's the same resolutions, it's the same countries making the same statements year after year, he wanted to be different. And that's what he demanded of me, was go find interesting stories, go find people and tell their stories. And that's become really an interest of mine.
Do we even need the UN? I mean, like, what at this stage, like, what good does it do? And can it be reformed, or is it totally hopeless? And I know that you've been asked a million times, probably, but just straight up, like, we know that it's theatrics. We know that it's full of, I mean, honestly, so much of it is full of shit. But there are good things that the UN does as well. But in the context of Israel, where are we going with the UN? Or are we not going anywhere?
No, in the context of Israel, it's an abysmal failure. You can look at the UN, you're forcing me to say nice things about the UN. But when you look at vaccination programs or food programs, or how is it that you put a stamp on something in Israel and then it ends up in Canada? There have to be these international agreements between countries. And the idea of the United Nations was to create a forum where countries could sit together and work things out for global cooperation. And in some respects, when you look at the elimination of diseases, or if you look at literacy rates or various items, okay, so the UN has had successes. When it comes to peace and security, we're in a different realm. When we're talking about Israel, it's something completely different. Ambassador Persor used to say that at the United Nations, it's not a double standard, it's a triple standard.
And I'll tell you what they are. I've done my homework. One is for dictatorships, right?
Mm-hmm.
And another one is for democracies. And then there's a completely separate one, which is Israel.
The third impossible standard for the state of Israel. You did do your homework. That's in my first book, which is called Speaking for Israel, which is a memoir about my experience working as the speechwriter for Israel at the UN. And you see
which everyone should read, by the way. I really recommend it.
Thank you. And you see this playing out time and again in the news every single day. I actually put this on social media today. Do you think for a moment, if we learned that UN staff were complicit in the murder and abduction of citizens of the United States or Germany or France, that for a moment that agency would continue to exist, never mind be funded by other Western nations? Of course not. And it's week after week, we get new evidence of the complicity of UNRWA in the atrocities of October 7th. We've known for years that UNRWA facilities, that the medical clinics and the schools are being used to store rockets. I was writing about that in speeches 10 years ago. We know that the electricity from those facilities was being used by the Hamas command centers underneath them. We know that you can't build a command center under a UN facility without somebody knowing that something is going on. There is abundant evidence, to say nothing of the actual terrorists on UNRWA's payroll, and they're still out fundraising every single day.
So what is the problem? Is it just like just these ridiculous countries and leadership just doing favors for each other all the time? I mean, how do you stop this corruption? Can you stop it?
Yeah, so I think what you see at the United Nations is a couple things. The perhaps well-meaning but misguided reflections of Western countries that perhaps believe that the Middle East can be treated like a Western country, that we share the same aspirations and values, and it's simply not the case. You definitely have rampant anti-Semitism and anti-Israel bias. Nobody's making a secret of that. And these dictators, these authoritarian regimes, abuse democratic norms of the United Nations, democratic norms that they don't allow their own citizens in order to bludgeon the West.
Yeah.
I was going to say, you have 193 countries that are member states of the United Nations. How many of them do you think are democracies?
Not many.
Or the answer is 87, so it's 45%. Less than half of the countries of the United Nations are democracies. It's the majority of people in the world don't live in democracies, and yet they get to go and abuse a democratic institution like the United Nations, where every country gets one vote, no matter how big, how large, how rich, how poor, how democratic, how repressive. And they use that against the democratic states. And we certainly see that playing out over and over and over again against Israel.
Well, we see it playing out also. I mean, it serves as a great example. You know, there's the micro level and the macro level of, if you think about what people do when they go to countries that are democracies and they're not coming from democracies, they maybe intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, are abusing the system. And you're seeing this epidemic now in a lot of Western countries where people are coming in and abusing the country's system just because they can, and they don't have that system where they came from. So I just see it as just a reflection of what you're seeing like in real life with people coming to other countries. I know that we don't have a lot of time. Usually we have a little bit of a longer conversation. And there's quite a few questions I want to get through, Aviva. And one of them is really about Boundless, because you founded Boundless after your work at the UN. Can you tell people what your mission is, what you're doing there?
Absolutely. So I co-founded Boundless 3 years ago alongside my friend, Dr. Rachel Fish. Boundless is a think action tank. So both Rachel and I have a lot of experience working in the fields of Israel and anti-Semitism. And when we were sort of reflecting or talking with one another about the big challenges, we just wanted to have the chance to try things a little bit differently. We felt like for too long there'd been a reliance on what's in our kishkas and a great deal on inertia. And we wanted things to be based and grounded in data. And so that's why we call ourselves a think action tank. We undertake original research. We also build off the research and learnings that other people are deriving. And then we translate it into action. So I'll give you an example. One of the things that I look at is the harms of social media, trying to understand what is the relationship between online anti-Semitism and real-world anti-Semitism, and to what extent does the platforms, the algorithms, the moderation policies, nefarious actors, bot activities contribute to all of this so that we can figure out some mitigation strategies. We also try to figure out how do we better talk to people about these issues. Research done by Boundless has found that 1/3 of Americans, the general population, don't know what anti-Semitism means. 2/3 don't know what Zionism means. So we're talking a lot using words that other people don't understand. And the first rule of communications, you know this better than most other people, is you need to understand who you want to speak to and then adapt accordingly. And Boundless is very much focused on figuring out who are priority audiences. What is the rationale from a data-driven perspective for why that particular audience? What do they know about any given topic? Where are they getting their news and information? Who are the credible voices? Because I can talk and tweet or post as much as I want, but it's probably not going to resonate with the type of people that we want to be speaking to. And so we need people that have credibility in their eyes to be the ones who are communicating these messages. And then we can, after all of that, figure out what is the most effective or persuasive messaging on a given topic.
So I think one of the things that you do at Boundless is like you do a lot of public opinion polling. So you have like a lot of deep insights into what Americans know and believe about Jews, Israel, and about this war. So I know that you talked about definitions of anti-Semitism and, of course, Zionism. But what what do the vast majority, I mean, if we can even make a generalization, if there's such a thing as your average American, which I don't think there is, but like if you had to paint in broad strokes the picture of what Americans think about, I don't know, Israel and or the Jewish people, how would you do that? I mean, what are the facts showing?
It's a big question.
Yeah, it's massive.
It's a big question from a lot of different perspectives. So first of all, there's new Harvard-Harris polling that's actually looking at the upcoming presidential election in the United States and the issue of both the war between Israel and Hamas, Israel and Hezbollah, as well as the issue of anti-Semitism in America are essentially non-issues in that election. Americans are going to go to the polls based on what you would expect, the economy, immigration, all sorts of domestic issues like that. It's very, very low. The issue of anti-Semitism polled at 2% as something that they care about in terms of the election. The second thing that we know is when you look at the general population, which means all ages from 18 and up, there is support for Israel over Hamas in the war. That doesn't feel like that on social media. It doesn't feel like that when we look at college campuses, but that's because there's an age bias. So overall, Americans do side with Israel. They can distinguish between right and wrong, between a terrorist organization and a democracy, but there is an age bias. The correlation between support for Israel or understanding and empathy for Jews is closely tied to two things, your age and your education level. So the older you are, the more supportive you are of Israel, the more education that you have about the history of Israel, who the Jewish people are, what Judaism is, those will also lend themselves to making people more likely to align with Israel over Hamas in this war. And we have a crisis because right now we're holding the support of the general population. But when you look at especially 18 to 24, or 25 to 29, you see that it's, if not 50-50, then sometimes it's leaning more towards Hamas than Israel.
Okay, so how do you explain that?
It's a product of an education system gone wrong. And so you have really an old strategy tied to new tactics. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union saw Israel as a Western colonialist outpost of the United States in the Middle East. It was too close for comfort. And they began a campaign to demonize Zionism that essentially equated Zionists and Jews with the greatest evil of the time, which at the time was the Nazis. And they were very successful in that campaign. And it slowly started to permeate Western academia. And it took a full foothold here because it was anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist. It was painted in a language that Western academics appreciated. And those Western academics became the professors that are now running and teaching institutions in America. And we're seeing the results of what is really a multi-generational, very effective strategy on the parts of the Soviets and to some extent the Arab nations as well.
You know, it's interesting that I speak to a lot of people who are just with the advocacy that I'm doing, a lot of people, as you can imagine, reach out. And they're still a year plus after October 7th, shocked at the silence of the world on October 8th and the amount of hatred. And I try and explain it's not a shock. You know, the signs have all been there. I mean, I've been doing the advocacy thing for around 15 years now almost. And I know that you've been in the trenches for a long time as well. It just happened behind the scenes of the general public. But people don't know that. A lot of people are still in shock as to how it came about. But if you look at the facts, it's all, even campus, you know, that stuff has been spoken about for like over 15 years now.
Exactly right. There's another component to it as well, which is that people don't know a lot about anti-Semitism and they don't know a lot about Zionism. And when you think about it, really, why would they? If we were to pick another country, would we be able to speak as experts on that issue? Probably not. And because they don't know what Zionism is, what they equate it with is what the rhetoric is saying it is, white Jewish supremacy. So we have work to do to explain exactly what Zionism is. And we have work to do to help people understand the difference between legitimate political protest and Jew hatred. Meaning there is nothing wrong with the fact that people hate war. That's actually a good thing. There's nothing wrong with the fact that people want to stand up for the Palestinians or support a Palestinian state. That's actually perfectly reasonable. The problem is when they're choosing to express themselves by going to a Jewish community center or a synagogue or a Jewish-owned business and chant globalize the Intifada or any of these other genocidal chants, that's a problem. But in their mind, they don't have the ability to distinguish between all these different elements because nobody's taught them about the difference between them. That's the work that we have to do.
Right. And I mean, my listeners at least have heard me say ad nauseum just the failure of the Jewish narrative over the last few decades. I mean, I think that what I'm about to say is quite obvious to you, which is like when you let others speak for you and it's organized and it's funded and they have a vision and it's relentless, which is what it's been for decades. And we, on the other hand, as the Jewish people, remain silent to the point where people don't even know what Zionism is. We do have a lot of work to do. So how is Boundless helping with that work? Like I know one of the things you do, for example, is with Chabad on campus. Like you
That's
educate
right.
like American college students. Like what are you teaching them? What's life like them for them? How do you see the next several years for American college students or American campuses? And what's impressed you about the students that you're meeting? I mean, I know that Chabad is one area.
Yeah. So we've been working, I'm very proud to say, we've been working with Chabad on campus. This is our third year now. Each year it's been about 20 campuses. And we work with the shluchim, with the rabbi and rebbitzin on the campuses. For many, many years, the focus of Chabad was on Jewish life on campus and less so on the Israel issue. But as we have seen over the last number of years, the conversations around Israel have become unavoidable, become central in many Jewish students or young people's lives. And so that's the partnership that we've built, which is helping to educate the Chabad staff about how they become Israel educators. Boundless is a B2B model, meaning we don't go and do frontline teaching. We're not trying to teach every young person in America, every college student, but we have a train the trainers approach. And each of these campuses on average that we work with are reaching thousands of students. We're able to reach about 20,000 students a year through our partnership. And now we've added 20 campuses each year. So it's growing year over year. In terms of what the future holds, at some point there's going to be an inflection. I personally think that the inflection is that you're seeing that these protesters are anti-American. And I think that might be the threshold of what the American general public will tolerate. I'm sad to say that the fact that this discrimination, harassment, and targeting of a minority population of Jews is not enough, it seems, to turn the tide. But when they see people burning American flags and vandalizing American monument, that does seem to rub Americans the wrong way. And my hope is that actually will be the inflection point, the turning point that helps to put Pandora back in the box. But we will have to see. We have to be mindful of a number of external factors, which is, first of all, we have this hyper-polarized society that we're living in. We have an election around the corner, and every day the rhetoric in this election is more divisive. We're seeing Jews and Israel being used as political footballs in these campaigns, which is incredibly unfortunate and not helpful. And then you have foreign intervention. The World Economic Forum puts out a report every year. And this year, for the first time, when they're looking at the threats that they see to the global order in the short term, the greatest threat is disinformation campaigns. Half of the world's adult population will go to elections this year. And there's a lot at stake. And so you see a lot of foreign actors trying to intervene and control what the outcome of these elections will be. So it's not only about the Jews. It's not only about Israel. There's a lot of big factors at play. And unfortunately, we find ourselves at the epicenter of this storm.
I'm not sure if you read the book by General MacArthur, Battlegrounds, but it's a book that I highly recommend. And in that book, which he published a few years ago after being an advisor to Trump, everyone was expecting him, they didn't get along. Everyone was expecting him to write a book that was a telltale on all things anti-Trump. And in the end, he took the high ground. And what he did was he highlighted China, North Korea, Russia, and Iran, of course.
Makes sense.
And it's all about disinformation, and it's all about how they have collectively, individually influenced with foreign intervention the West. And it's a brilliant book. I highly recommend that everyone reads it, and I think you'd find it really interesting. You talked about like social media now, and that's a place where, you didn't talk about it, but like I'm making the connection to disinformation through social media. So it's not exactly the place to have like educational or meaningful conversations, I've found. But we're both very active on social, you on X and me on a few other platforms. And I read somewhere, I can't remember if it's true, that you don't read the comments and you don't read the DMs. And I just...
Much to people's annoyance. I mean,
Yeah.
the DM seems to be to people's annoyance because they find another way to get to me. And then the comments, the reason I don't read the comments, and actually the reason I don't read the DMs, is because about 1/4 of the conversations about Israel and Hamas, about Israel and this conflict, are inauthentic, meaning it's bots. And so there's a 1 in 4 chance you're arguing with a robot, and they can be sophisticated. It can be an avatar. It can look like a person. It can function. It can seem to have coherent sentences written. It can message you, and still it's a robot.
So what are you trying to accomplish on social? I mean, I know it's a quarter, so you have another 3/4 or 2/3 of actual people. And I like your concept of calling in and calling out, which I'd love you to talk about. But what are you trying to accomplish overall?
So the funny thing is, I've been on social media, I've been on X a long time. And when I'm posting something up, actually, I don't have a grand strategy that I'm trying to talk to this person and convince them of that thing. It's actually fueled by indignation. And it really does go back to my time at the United Nations, which is I read something and I go, like hell, that'll be the last word on that. And then I fire off a post and then I've moved on. Now, some people are quite fixated on a bunch of posts ago, but I move on to the next thing where I'm in a daily cycle of indignation. You just have to look at the news to see that there's no shortage of what's happening on campuses in American politics, and certainly in the Middle East and in the international institutions. And so that's sort of what's going on with me from a researcher's perspective, because that's how I try to look at it. The question that we have to ask about social media is, you're right, it's a terrible forum for education. It is not a forum for having thoughtful, nuanced, even-tempered conversations. I always liken social media to the Colosseum in ancient Rome. It's a blood sport. And basically, you have two people in the center of the arena battling it to the death, trying to bludgeon one another. And then you have everybody else, the cheery, lustily crowds.
Well, it depends which platform, because I think X is that.
This is for sure X. That's is not X, so much. Yeah. You'll get banned, you'll get blocked and punished on the other platforms if you try to post the same type of thing. But on X, certainly you have everybody else that's like watching and cheering and screaming it on. And it's like, a battle to the death or cancellation or whatever the final outcome is going to be. That's not conducive to education. At the same time, unfortunately, we know that many people are getting their education from social media. That's just the reality. And we haven't figured out how to adapt appropriately as a result. In education, we care about what people think, what people believe, and how people behave. On social media, when I look at impression or engagement figures, they don't tell me anything about what people know, what they believe, and how they behave. It tells me the extent to which they engage with my post, but the rule on social media is if it enrages, it engages. So the more you agree with me, or the more you disagree with me, is what's going to drive my engagement, which again has nothing to do with knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors. But this I do know, because this people come and tell me in person quite a bit, which is that because I'm using my voice in the world, because I'm full of indignation on a daily basis, there are other people who don't feel that they can speak up in the way that I do. And they're at sort of a loss for words. And they're feeling isolated and they're feeling scared. And because I'm using my voice in the world, it's helping them feel a little bit less alone and perhaps giving them language for their own conversations. That's the only thing that I know for sure that I'm doing. And if that's all I'm doing, it's a lot.
It's really a lot. I think you're aware, and you've been in the campaign for I'm That Jew, which is not a campaign, really. It's what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to help people be more vocal about being Jewish. So I know, and I'm imagining that you know, that when Jewish people say I'm that Jew, or they say they can comfortably express and publicly use their voice to say that they're Jewish, then their feelings of loneliness or a lack of confidence or a fear of saying the wrong thing perhaps are diminished.
I totally agree. And I think your campaign, which I love very much, adds another dimension, which is a source of pride.
Yes. And well, first of all, thank you. And I'm honored that you're in it as well. The idea is to celebrate Jewish people, but it's like the first thing is identity. If like you can't have pride unless you have identity. So the idea is to encourage people to own and to be able to comfortably say that they're Jewish. And I'm just wondering, do you see, I mean, it might be a bit of an obvious question, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, the change that this year there has been a change where all of a sudden there's I call it the awakening of the Jewish narrative, that people are waking up. And I see that as one of the big changes this year. Do you find that there are more and more people who are ready or feeling more comfortable to publicly express, I'm Jewish, this is my truth? And how critical is that to the future of the Jewish people?
Oh, well, the second part is much easier, which is it's absolutely fundamental to the future of the Jewish people. I can answer the first part because we actually did research on this. Boundless did an entire study to understand the impact of October 7th and the aftermath, all this anti-Semitism on young American Jews between the ages of 18 to 40. And what we found is that people are looking for the security of being in Jewish community. So you have synagogue attendance up, programming for young Jews is being up. People are looking for that community that helps them feel less isolated and less alone. At the same time, they're hiding their Jewish identity more in public, and they're talking about the cost that they have to pay, either for identifying as a Jew or for identifying as being supportive or in connection to Israel. And they're increasingly hiding that component of their identity because it's seeing them be excluded either from a friend group or from a club or from colleagues. And so it's sort of a good news, bad news story. It's great that people are tapping into their Jewish heritage and their Jewish roots, and there's a greater desire to learn and be in community, and the price we're paying is high.
In the short run, but do you think that the price that we're paying is going to be high in the long run? Because that's the thing, that's the rub. It's like, you have to own who you are. And if, to me personally, if living a good life is being who you are, and if you're not able to be who you are, and there's nothing wrong with who you are, I mean, you're a good person, you're a kind person, you work hard, you're a family person, you serve the community, a decent human being. If you have to hide who you are, is that worth the price? And that's a conversation that I find myself having over and over and over again with people who are literally scared to say that they're Jewish. And it is scary right now. I mean, I don't think a lot of non-Jewish people understand that you can be canceled, not just if you're a celebrity, like let's say David Draymond from Disturbed or Matisyahu or Brett Gelman, a public figure, or Michael Rappaport, who I know is a good friend of yours. You can be canceled if you're at work. If you have a corporate job, you can be canceled as a college student. But the price of not being able to be who you are and be vocal about who you are, to me, is a very difficult thing to watch people compromising.
There are moments when history intrudes upon ordinary lives. That's what happened to all of us. That is what's happening to all of us. Nobody asked for this, and it's not fair. And yet this is the reality. And we don't get a choice about the way that the world is treating us. We have a choice in how we respond. And we know they don't like us when we're loud, and they don't like us when we're quiet. They don't like us when we're rich. They don't like us when we're poor. They don't like us when we stand up for ourselves, and they don't like us when we cower. So it's not about them, and it's not about their response. You're exactly right. It's about who we are and how centered we are and who we are and what our identity is and who we want to be in the world.
Amen, sister. I absolutely love what you just said. In fact, I think that's going to be what we put out there, because that was just everything I'm trying to say, but said so much better. Aviva, I got to ask you one more question because time's up. What's a question that no one's asked you that you wish they had, maybe, like on a podcast?
Well, in this podcast, I'm wishing you'd ask me about my new book, which is called Stand Up Nation. It just came out in July.
I was going to do the outro about that, but okay, you beat me to it. First of all, let's talk about Stand Up Nation.
Amazing. I'm so glad that you asked.
Yeah.
So I just put out a new book. I actually started writing this book 5 years ago. It was 5 years in the making, but the origins go right back to my time as speechwriter for Israel at the UN. As I said, I was so busy, so overwhelmed and churning out information. But whenever it came time to write a speech on international development, I would fall down this rabbit hole reading about Golda Meir, the early years of Israel's founding, its pioneers, and this spirit, this desire to be in the world. And I thought it was the most compelling story and this largely untold story of Israel. Israel in its first 10 years is desperately poor. It is a developing country. And it's in that context that Israel sets up an international development agency. It has one before the United States, before Canada, before the United Kingdom. And in my book, I tell the story of how that came to be. And then I profile about 18 different Israeli organizations that are working today in international development in the fields of solar and healthcare and, of course, agriculture, which is huge. And there's lessons that I tied to the present day. I rewrote the introduction of the book in light of October 7th, and we put postscripts on many of the chapters based on what people that I interviewed had to say in reflection on October 7th. And the most important part of the book coming out right now is that it's an important reminder that Jewish people have always been the author of our own story. We determine what our future is going to look like. On October 7th, Hamas wrote one page in the book of the story of the Jewish people, a horrific page and a painful page, but that's it. They're done, and we write the rest of what this is going to look like. We've always had a choice, whether we're going to turn inward and be isolated, or we're going to turn outward and engage with the world. And we've always continued to do that, even and especially when the world isn't fair to us. That was true back in 1948. It was true back in the 50s when Israel started its international development work, and it's still true today.
The answer to me is, I assume obvious, but you know what they say about assuming. So you're so focused, hyper-focused, driven by getting the truth about Israel out there. Why? Why is it so important to you?
I'm just a Venn diagram where it meets in the center. I grew up in a traditional household where we had to be home on Friday nights. There was a white tablecloth on the table. We lit Shabbat candles, but that was about the extent of it. We weren't observant. Keeping Shabbat, you're keeping kosher. Israel has been a part of my life for a long time. Again, not from sort of a religious perspective, but from a very much coupled as a peoplehood, a nation, a partnership perspective. And for many years, when I started my career, I worked as a policy advisor in government. I love working in government. I love being a speechwriter. I love being a policy advisor. But when I went to work for Israel at the UN, it all really just clicked for me. It felt meaningful. It gave me a sense of purpose. And that sense of meaning and purpose has really extended now until the present day when I was able to found and to run Boundless. And it's that confluence, that Venn diagram is what's really interesting to me, what's really important to me, and where I have a skill set, something to contribute to the world. And I'm sitting at the intersection of that.
Brilliant. I could keep talking with you, but I know that we have to wrap. Aviva, first of all, thank you for being on I'm That. I think what you're doing is incredible. I learn a lot from you. I'm not an ex-fiend, but I go on and I see what you're putting up there, and you're such a powerful voice. So just thank you. And I've read your first book. I'm looking forward to the second one, which is Stand Up Nation, which is, of course, going to be in the intro to the podcast, which will be there. And I'm just looking forward to meeting you in person because we've spoken a few times. But just thank you in the meantime. Just keep doing what you're doing. You're doing tremendous work. And thank you. A lot of gratitude to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome. Well, that's it. Thank you for joining me on I'm That. I hope you enjoyed the chat, and I hope you'll join me for our next guest. In the meantime, definitely hit subscribe, whether you're on Apple, Amazon, Spotify, Google, or any other platform. And if you can, leave a comment, give it a like, and tell your friends. That would be brilliant. Stay tuned for the next show, and see you soon.